There is a moment, quiet and unremarkable on the surface, when someone looks at you and feels something they cannot name. It is not attraction in the ordinary sense, and it is not dislike either. It sits somewhere underneath both, in a place most people never learn to examine. You have felt this before, maybe in a friendship that suddenly turned cold for no visible reason. Maybe in a relationship where kindness was met with distance instead of gratitude. You gave warmth, and somehow it came back as resentment. You offered understanding, and somewhere along the way it curdled into silence, sarcasm, or a slow withdrawal you never saw coming. If you are the kind of person who feels everything, who notices what others try to hide, who senses the truth underneath the words being spoken, then you already know this pattern intimately, even if you have never had language for it. What you are about to hear is not a comforting story about being too good for this world. It is something more precise, more uncomfortable, and ultimately more useful than that. It is the psychology of why the very light you carry becomes, for certain people, unbearable to stand near, and by the end, you will understand something about your relationships that will be very difficult to unsee. Most people assume an empath's light is simply kindness or emotional softness. That is the surface. Underneath it is something sharper: awareness. The ability to perceive what is actually happening beneath a conversation, beneath a smile, beneath the careful performance most people maintain to feel safe in their own lives. You notice when someone's words don't match their tone. You catch the flicker of hesitation before a lie, the tightness in a voice trying to sound casual, the thing left unsaid that matters more than everything that was said. And here is what makes this dangerous for you without you ever intending it to be. You don't have to say anything. Your noticing is enough. Your presence alone acts like a mirror, and not everyone wants to look into a mirror that clear. Most human beings spend enormous energy managing the discomfort of their own unresolved parts. They build a version of themselves designed to avoid pain rather than confront it. This is not a character flaw. It is a survival strategy almost everyone learns early in life. But it comes with a cost. It requires constant upkeep, constant small denials, constant reinforcement of a story that keeps the deeper insecurities buried where they can't be examined. Now put someone like you into that picture, not trying to expose anyone, not trying to challenge anyone's carefully built identity, just existing, seeing clearly, feeling accurately. And that alone starts to crack something in the people who are not ready to be seen. Here's the part almost nobody talks about, and it's the part that changes everything. When people feel exposed by your presence, not literally, not because you said anything accusatory, but internally, quietly, they rarely respond with curiosity about themselves. They don't stop and ask, "Why do I feel unsettled around this person?" Instead, they look outward for someone to blame, and the easiest target is you. What starts as a private, unspoken recognition slowly turns into a subtle campaign of resistance. A dismissive comment here, a sarcastic remark there, a shift in warmth that seems to come from nowhere, because from your side, nothing happened. No fight, no confrontation, no obvious reason. But the trigger was never something you did. It was something your presence made them feel about themselves. This is where resentment quietly begins to take root, and it rarely looks like resentment at first. It hides behind indifference, behind forced politeness, behind jokes that carry a slightly sharper edge than they should. Underneath all of that is one specific psychological truth. You represent an honesty they are not living up to, and people do not resent what they fail to notice. They resent what keeps reminding them. What makes this even harder is that people like you often sense the tension before you, understand it, and instinctively try to fix it. You become more agreeable. You choose your words more carefully. You dim the very awareness that made someone uncomfortable in the first place, hoping that softening yourself will restore the peace. But it never actually works, because the discomfort was never about anything you said or did. It was about what you represented simply by being yourself. You cannot negotiate someone else's internal conflict on their behalf, and the more you shrink to avoid triggering it, the more you teach yourself that your own clarity is something shameful, something you need to hide to keep others comfortable. That is not a sustainable way to live, and somewhere inside you, you already know it. There is something almost philosophical happening underneath all of this. Your awareness is not just an emotional trait, it is alignment with something true. And truth doesn't need to raise its voice to be disruptive. It simply exists, and its existence alone challenges anything that isn't standing on the same honest ground. So when someone reacts badly to you, it is very rarely a verdict on something you did wrong. Far more often, it is a reflection of something they are avoiding in themselves. Once you understand that, everything shifts. You stop trying to manage their reaction and start observing the pattern instead. You stop absorbing their discomfort as evidence of your own flaw and start recognizing it as information about where they are. Being called too much, too intense, or too sensitive is often just someone's way of describing a level of perception they are not ready to meet. That does not mean you dim your light. It means you learn when to offer it, when to protect it, and when to accept that not every person, not every room, is built to hold it. If you keep watching the pattern long enough, you'll notice something else, something that most people never realize until they've already been drained by it. People like you don't just attract connection, you attract need, and those two things are not the same, even though they can look almost identical at first. Connection is mutual. It has respect, reciprocity, and awareness running in both directions. Need is one-directional. It seeks relief, validation, or emotional supply, and it takes without giving much thought to what it's taking from. People who listen more than they speak, who observe before reacting, who offer understanding before judgment, unconsciously broadcast a kind of psychological safety. To someone emotionally grounded, that safety feels like trust, but to someone who is unstable or emotionally underdeveloped, that same safety feels like an open door. And once someone realizes they can be understood without ever having to fully understand themselves, they start leaning on you as an external processing system. Their confusion becomes your responsibility. Their unresolved emotions become something you sort through for them. At first, this can feel meaningful. It can feel like purpose, like you are genuinely making someone's life better. And often, you are. But what quietly goes unnoticed is the growing imbalance. One person gives energy and insight, the other consumes it. In a healthy dynamic, this would correct itself naturally over time. The other person would grow, take ownership, start contributing emotionally in return. In an unhealthy one, the opposite happens. The more you give, the more they take, and the more they take, the more they start to depend on you not as a person, but as a resource. And here is the quiet danger hidden inside that dependence. It breeds entitlement. What was once appreciated slowly becomes expected. What was once received with gratitude eventually becomes something they feel they deserve. And when you inevitably reach your limit, because no one can sustain endless output forever, the tone of the relationship changes overnight. This confuses people like you more than almost anything else, because from your perspective nothing negative happened. You were patient. You were present. You gave what you had to give. So when the other person suddenly turns cold, critical, or even hostile, it feels like it came out of nowhere. But it didn't come out of nowhere. It came from a slow psychological imbalance that had been quietly building the entire time. At some point, they stopped simply appreciating what you gave and started measuring themselves against it. And that comparison is uncomfortable, because your stability, your clarity, your capacity to hold your own emotions highlights a gap in their own. Instead of using that gap as motivation to grow, many people choose an easier path. They reframe your strength as a threat instead of an inspiration. Your consistency becomes too much. Your insight becomes overanalyzing. Your depth becomes intensity. None of these labels are accurate descriptions of you. They are defense mechanisms, a way of reducing the discomfort of recognizing something in you that they haven't yet built in themselves. And so the very qualities that first drew them to you become, over time, the qualities that irritate them. Not because you changed, but because their relationship to what you represent changed. What once felt supportive starts to feel exposing. What once felt grounding starts to feel confronting. And here is the uncomfortable truth many people take years to fully accept. Some people are never drawn to who you are. They are drawn to what you provide. There is a real difference between being appreciated and being used, and it usually only reveals itself with time. This doesn't mean everyone who has ever leaned on you had bad intentions. Most of the time it's unconscious. People repeat patterns they don't understand, seeking relief wherever they can find it. And when they find someone who offers emotional clarity, they attach to it without realizing what they're doing. But unconscious behavior still leaves consequences behind. And if you don't recognize the pattern early, you can spend years overextending yourself, trying to sustain a dynamic that was never built to last. You give more, hoping it restores the balance. You explain more, hoping it creates understanding. But the structure underneath doesn't change, because it was never built on mutual exchange. It was built on extraction. So what do you actually do with this awareness? First, stop mistaking constant need for deep connection. They are not the same thing. Depth is measured by mutual investment, not by how heavily someone leans on you. Second, watch closely how people respond when your access is simply limited, not removed. just limited? Do they become more self-aware, more respectful of your time and energy? Or do they become frustrated, distant, even resentful? That single reaction will tell you almost everything you need to know about the true nature of that relationship. And finally, recalibrate your role entirely. You are not responsible for regulating anyone else's emotional state. You are not obligated to be the permanent, always available source of clarity in someone else's confusion. Your ability to understand people deeply is a gift, but it was never meant to be a resource available without limits. Because the moment giving becomes your entire identity, you attract people who are only there to take. And if you don't define where that giving ends, someone else will define it for you, usually by taking everything they can before you notice. There is a moment almost everyone like you eventually reaches, and it rarely arrives with any drama. It shows up quietly, almost privately, as a simple internal realization. The way you've been showing up for people is no longer something you can sustain. You start noticing the imbalance more clearly than ever before. You feel the exhaustion of constant availability. You recognize, sometimes painfully, that your willingness to understand others has rarely been matched by their willingness to understand you. And from that recognition, something in you begins to shift. You start setting boundaries, not out of anger, not as punishment, but simply as clarity. You say no where you used to automatically say yes. You pause before responding instead of reacting instantly. You start questioning dynamics you once accepted without a second thought. And from where you're standing, this feels like correction. It feels grounded. It feels overdue. But from the perspective of someone who quietly benefited from your lack of boundaries, it can feel like something being taken away from them. And loss, especially loss no one openly names, tends to produce resistance. This is where things get psychologically interesting, because boundaries don't only limit behavior, they redefine an entire relationship. They introduce structure where there used to be unrestricted access, and for someone accustomed to that access, even a reasonable limit can feel abrupt, even unfair, even if objectively it isn't either of those things. Here is the detail almost nobody notices in the moment. People rarely react to what a boundary actually is. They react to what the boundary takes away from them. If someone was used to unlimited emotional access to your time, your patience, your attention, then even a small, gentle boundary can feel enormous. Not because it's cruel, but because it disrupts a pattern they'd quietly grown to depend on. And when that pattern breaks, not everyone adjusts by becoming more self-aware. Some adjust by becoming defensive instead. They start reinterpreting your behavior entirely. What used to look like kindness now gets labeled inconsistency. What used to be appreciated now gets questioned out loud. You might hear things like, "You've changed," or "You're not the same anymore." Phrases that sound like observations but are really just discomfort, wearing a different mask. And in a strange way, they're not wrong. You have changed. Just not in the way they're implying. You haven't gone cold. You've become precise. You haven't withdrawn your care. You've simply redefined how and where it gets expressed. The distinction rarely registers with the other person, though, because from where they stand, change is measured only by access, and when access decreases, it gets misread as rejection. This is where insecurity tends to surface, because boundaries don't just limit interaction, they introduce accountability. They quietly require the other person to take a more active role in managing their own emotions and expectations instead of outsourcing that job to you. And for someone unused to carrying that responsibility, it can feel deeply uncomfortable. So instead of adjusting internally, many people try to restore the old dynamic externally. Sometimes it's direct. They question the boundary, challenge it, try to negotiate around it. Sometimes it's indirect. They quietly test it, waiting to see if pressure will make you revert to old patterns. And when neither approach works, the response often turns emotional. Frustration becomes criticism. Discomfort becomes distance. And your clarity, the very thing that once felt like safety to them, becomes the new target. This is where many people like you feel an internal pull, because you can sense the shift happening in real time, the tension, the coolness, the change in tone. And there's a part of you that wants to smooth it all over immediately, to explain more, to soften the boundary, to make everything feel comfortable again like it used to. But that instinct, however understandable, comes with a real cost. Every time you compromise a boundary just to protect someone else's comfort, you teach both of you the same lesson, that your limits bend under enough pressure. And once that lesson is learned, consistency becomes almost impossible to hold on to. So the actual challenge was never setting the boundary, it's holding it. And holding it requires a different kind of strength than most people expect. Not loud, not aggressive, quiet, and steady, and consistent. It's the ability to let someone else feel uncomfortable without immediately rushing to fix that discomfort for them. It's the willingness to let them have their reaction without absorbing it as your own responsibility. That is the real turning point. Because the moment you stop managing how others feel about your boundaries, the true nature of every relationship in your life starts to reveal itself with total clarity. People who genuinely respect you will adjust, even if they don't love the change at first. They'll recognize it as valid. But people who were mainly benefiting from your lack of limits will struggle, not because the boundary is unfair, but because it removes something they weren't prepared to lose. And in that struggle, their real character becomes far more visible than it ever was before. That visibility isn't a problem, it's information, and it tells you clearly who was ever connected to you versus who was only ever connected to your availability. So if there is one thing to take from all of this, it's this. When your boundaries upset someone, they are almost never reacting to the limit itself. They're reacting to the loss of control that limit creates for them. And that reaction is not proof you did something wrong. It's proof you finally did something right. Because the moment your no starts disrupting someone else's expectations, is the exact moment you stop living according to those expectations. That is where genuine self-respect actually begins. There is one final layer to this entire pattern, and it doesn't become visible until you have already started changing. It isn't about what you give anymore, and it isn't even about the boundaries you set. It's about what happens the moment you start growing internally, quietly, in ways that fundamentally reshape how you see yourself and everyone around you. Because real growth, in its most honest form, is disruptive. Not loudly, not intentionally, but internally. It raises your standards. It lowers your tolerance for things you once accepted. It recalibrates what feels aligned and what suddenly doesn't fit anymore. For someone as perceptive as you, this kind of growth usually arrives after accumulating enough experience. You've watched enough patterns repeat. You've felt enough imbalance to finally name it. You reach a point where awareness stops being optional and simply becomes part of who you are. And once that integration happens, you relate to people differently. You become more selective, not out of judgment, but out of clarity. You listen differently. You respond differently. The old urgency to fix, to explain, to carry weight that was never yours to carry, quietly fades. There's a shift from constant participation to calm observation, from reaction to intention. From the inside, this feels like alignment, like finally coming home to yourself. But from the outside, especially to people who haven't gone through anything similar, it can feel like distance. And this is exactly where the tension deepens, because your growth doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists in contrast to everyone still standing exactly where they always were. It quietly highlights differences in awareness, in responsibility, in emotional maturity, and for someone who has remained stuck in the same patterns, that contrast becomes very hard to ignore. It creates a silent comparison, one you never intended to start, and may not even acknowledge out loud, but one they feel deeply anyway. They notice the shift in your energy. They notice the conversations changing. They notice the access changing. And whether they say it directly or not, they begin measuring that difference against themselves. For someone genuinely open to growth, this contrast can actually be motivating. It can spark reflection, even inspire them to close the gap and meet you where you now stand. But not everyone responds that way. For some people, that same contrast doesn't inspire. It threatens, because growth demands confrontation. It demands acknowledging what was never addressed, never resolved, never developed. And for someone unwilling to face that, your evolution becomes an uncomfortable mirror reflecting their own stagnation back at them. And reminders we never asked for tend to produce resistance rather than gratitude. So instead of moving toward their own growth, they move into reinterpretation instead. They begin reframing your change in ways that protect their current position. You get labeled distant, detached, maybe even arrogant. Your calm gets mistaken for indifference. Your clarity gets mistaken for rigidity. Your silence gets mistaken for judgment. None of these interpretations are objective. They are defensive, allowing the other person to preserve their current identity without ever confronting the discomfort that real change requires. Because if your growth can be dismissed as something negative, it no longer needs to be understood, and it can simply be pushed aside. This is where resentment finally takes its most defined shape. Because now it isn't only about what you represent, it's about what your growth implies. It implies change is genuinely possible. It implies old patterns can actually be broken. It implies the limitations someone has quietly accepted in themselves might not be as fixed as they've convinced themselves they are. And that implication, for someone who has chosen comfort over change, can feel like unbearable pressure, not because you're applying it, but because your simple existence contradicts the story they've been telling themselves. You become living proof that another path exists, one that requires honesty, effort, and real accountability. And when someone isn't ready to walk that path, they often reject it, not always directly, not always even consciously, but through small shifts. A noticeable lack of support, a quiet withdrawal of enthusiasm, a tone that carries just enough distance to be felt, but never quite named. From where you stand, this can feel confusing at first, because your growth was never an attempt to create distance. It was an attempt to come into alignment with yourself. You weren't trying to separate from anyone. You were trying to become more grounded, more honest, more real. But growth has an unavoidable consequence. It changes the structure of every relationship it touches. And not every relationship was built to evolve. Some were only ever built on shared habits, shared comfort, shared levels of awareness that never demanded more. And when one person moves beyond that shared space, the relationship either grows with them, or it quietly falls apart. That isn't failure. That's simply reality settling into place. The mistake many people like you make at this exact point is trying to preserve the old pun connection, while already living as a new version of themselves. You over-explain. You minimize how much you've grown. You revisit behaviors you've already outgrown, just to keep the peace. But that only creates internal conflict, because you cannot move forward while constantly stepping backward to fit into something that no longer fits you. Growth demands consistency. It demands honoring the changes you've made, even when those changes create friction in the people and spaces around you. And that requires a very different kind of strength. Not the strength to endure everything quietly, but the strength to accept. To accept that not everyone will grow alongside you. To accept that some people will only ever understand your evolution through the lens of their own limitations. To accept that being fully understood was never a requirement for being fully aligned. Because once you reach a certain level of self-awareness, your responsibility shifts entirely. It stops being about how correctly everyone around you perceives you. It becomes about living in a way that stays internally consistent, even when that consistency creates friction outside of you. And when you can hold that position without resenting yourself for it, everything changes. You stop interpreting their reaction as a personal rejection and start seeing it, clearly, for what it actually is, a reflection of exactly where they are, not a verdict on who you've become. And that single shift in perspective lets you move forward without carrying weight that was never yours, without trying to fix what was never yours to fix, and without shrinking yourself just to preserve connections that would only ever fit an older, smaller version of who you used to be. Because growth was never just about becoming more. It's about becoming more honest. And honesty, fully lived, has a quiet way of separating what actually aligns with you from what never truly did. So if there's one thing worth carrying with you from everything you've just heard, let it be this. Your growth will not always be celebrated by the people who benefited most from your previous version, and that was never a reason to slow down. If anything, it's the clearest reason to keep going. Because the moment you start questioning your own evolution just to protect someone else's, comfort is the exact moment you begin abandoning the very progress that made you who you are now. So tell me honestly, in the comments below, have you ever felt someone pull away from you, or turn cold toward you, right after you finally set a boundary, or right after you finally started growing into yourself? What did that feel like when it happened? And looking back now, what do you understand about it that you didn't understand back then?